The Lotus 33 is one of those Formula One cars that did not look like a revolution, yet in reality, it managed to change history. It was not as visually groundbreaking as the Lotus 25. It did not possess the dramatic fame of the later Lotus 49 with the Cosworth DFV engine, nor the futuristic aura of the machines from the late 1960s. And yet it was precisely the Lotus 33 that became the weapon with which Jim Clark demolished the competition in 1965 and secured his second Formula One World Championship. It was a car that appeared simple, low, delicate, and incredibly elegant. But beneath its aluminum skin hid one of the most refined constructions of the 1.5-liter Formula One era. The Lotus 33 was an evolution of the brilliant Lotus 25, the first truly successful Formula One car built around a monocoque chassis. But Colin Chapman and Len Terry did far more than apply cosmetic improvements. They improved rigidity, simplified the construction, adapted the suspension to wider Dunlop tires, and created a machine that in Jim Clark's hands became almost impossible to beat. During the 1965 season, Clark won 5 World Championship Grands Prix in the Lotus 33, and had he not skipped the Monaco Grand Prix in favor of the Indianapolis 500, his domination could have looked even more absurd. It was during that very same season that Clark also won the Indianapolis 500, captured Formula 2 titles, and achieved victories in the Tasman Series. The Lotus 33 therefore became part of one of the most extraordinary seasons ever achieved by a racing driver. The history of the Lotus 33 begins with the Lotus 25, the car that introduced Formula One to a completely new era in 1962. Colin Chapman understood that the traditional tubular frame had reached its limits, and that the future belonged to monocoque construction. The Lotus 25 featured an aluminum monocoque that was significantly stiffer and lighter than traditional chassis designs. Jim Clark used that advantage perfectly, winning the 1963 World Championship. The problem was that Formula One evolved at a terrifying pace, and tires, suspension systems, and engines demanded increasingly better integration. The Lotus 33 was created precisely as an answer to those demands. It was not an entirely new car, but rather a deep evolution of the existing concept. Chapman and Len Terry retained the basic philosophy of the Lotus 25, while refining the monocoque, simplifying its structure, and strengthening the chassis. The car was designed around new 13-inch wheels and wider Dunlop tires that required revised suspension geometry. The rear section of the car was also modified to better accommodate newer versions of the Coventry Climax V8 engine. In practice, the Lotus 33 became a more mature, more stable, and easier to develop successor to the Lotus 25. It was never intended to be a revolution on paper. It was intended to win championships, and that is exactly what it did. From an engineering standpoint, the Lotus 33 represented Chapman's philosophy perfectly. Simplify, then add lightness. The car was built around an aluminum monocoque that was stiffer than the one used in the Lotus 25, while also being easier to manufacture. Later examples used simpler inner side panels that improved structural integrity and made production more efficient. At the front, the car featured upper rocker arms and lower wishbones, with Armstrong spring and damper units mounted inboard. At the rear, there were upper transverse links, twin radius rods, and reversed lower wishbones, with outboard spring and damper units. The entire suspension layout was lightweight, precise, and focused on minimizing unsprung weight. The car ran on Dunlop tires, and during the 1965 season, Team Lotus adopted newer cast alloy wheels with central knockoff hubs, making wheel changes quicker while also improving brake cooling. The Lotus 33 weighed approximately 451 kilograms, which was an astonishing figure even by the standards of the era. With such low weight, even the relatively modest power of a 1.5-liter engine was enough to make the Lotus frighteningly fast. It was not a car that won through brute horsepower alone. It won through lightness, rigidity, aerodynamic efficiency, precision, and the brilliance of its driver. The heart of the Lotus 33 was the Coventry Climax FWMV engine, a naturally aspirated V8 with a displacement of approximately 1,497 cubic centimeters. Depending on specification, it produced around 200 to 220 horsepower. In the mid-1960s, these were excellent figures, especially in a car weighing less than half a ton. The engine used a 90-degree V8 layout and was mounted behind the driver in a mid-engine configuration. During the 1965 season, Lotus also utilized a newer 32-valve version that delivered more power but initially suffered from reliability problems and high oil consumption. That very engine became one of the key elements of the dramatic 1965 British Grand Prix, where Jim Clark had to nurse the car to victory despite severe oil pressure issues. Power was transmitted to the rear wheels through a 5-speed ZF manual gearbox. The Lotus 33 featured no electronic driver aids, no traction control, and no computers. Everything depended on mechanics, throttle control, steering precision, and driver bravery. Today, 210 horsepower may sound modest, but in a car weighing approximately 451 kilograms, it resulted in an exceptional power-to-weight ratio. More importantly, the Lotus was not only fast in a straight line. Its greatest strength lay in cornering speed, stability, and extraordinary chassis communication. The Lotus 33 made its debut in 1964 during the non-championship Aintree 200 race. Jim Clark qualified strongly, drove impressively, and set the fastest lap, but the car failed to finish after a crash while lapping a slower competitor. The early months were not easy. The new design required development, and Team Lotus continued to rely heavily on the proven Lotus 25. The Lotus 33 made its World Championship debut at the 1964 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, but both Clark and Mike Spence struggled with the car. The 1964 season ended in enormous disappointment for Clark, though not entirely because of the Lotus 33 itself. In the final race in Mexico, Clark still had a chance to win the World Championship. He was leading and appeared on course to reclaim the title, but with only 2 laps remaining, he suffered engine trouble. John Surtees eventually won the championship for Ferrari. The moment demonstrated the brutal reality of Formula One during that era. The fastest driver and the fastest car were not always enough. Reliability was equally important. During 1964, the Lotus 33 showed flashes of greatness, but it was not until the following season that the car revealed its full potential. The 1965 season represented the absolute peak of the Lotus 33 and one of the greatest displays of domination in Formula One history. Jim Clark opened the championship by winning the South African Grand Prix and then steadily built an overwhelming advantage. He skipped the Monaco Grand Prix because he was competing at the Indianapolis 500, which he won in a Lotus 38 powered by a Ford engine. Upon returning to Europe, Clark claimed victories in Belgium, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and Germany. 5 World Championship victories came in the Lotus 33, and his advantage over the competition was at times humiliating. At the rain-soaked Spa circuit, he disappeared into the distance, while most other drivers simply fought to survive. Clark later explained that success in those conditions was not about pressing the throttle harder than everyone else, but about lifting off slightly later and slightly less than his rivals. That perfectly described his driving style. He never looked aggressive or dramatic. He was smooth, precise, and devastatingly fast. The Lotus 33 suited such a driver perfectly. It was light, responsive, and demanded finesse. In the hands of an average driver, it could be difficult, but in Clark's hands, it became a surgical instrument. One of the most legendary performances by the Lotus 33 came during the 1965 British Grand Prix at Silverstone. Jim Clark led the race, but toward the end, his engine began misfiring and oil pressure dropped catastrophically. The newer 32-valve Coventry Climax V8 suffered from severe oil consumption issues. Clark, fully aware of the risk of total engine failure, adopted an extraordinary driving technique. Through Silverstone's long corners, he would shift into neutral and allow the car to coast in order to reduce engine load. To spectators, it looked surreal. The Lotus would emerge from corners almost silently before the engine suddenly roared back to life on the straights. Graham Hill and the BRM closed the gap at an astonishing pace. The margin shrank lap after lap, while the crowd watched a drama that became a battle not only between drivers, but also between man and machine. Clark ultimately won by just a few seconds. It was his fourth consecutive victory in the British Grand Prix, and one of the races that best demonstrated the magnitude of his talent. The Lotus 33 was not perfect that day. It was wounded, fragile, and close to mechanical collapse. Yet Clark still managed to bring it home victorious. Stories like this build a car's legend far more than statistics ever could. Equally important was the 1965 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. Clark arrived with a realistic chance of sealing the World Championship. The Nürburgring at that time was the most demanding circuit in Formula One, long, terrifying, and merciless toward both cars and drivers. Lotus 33, chassis R11, was fitted with an enlarged oil tank because the team feared lubrication problems with the engine. Clark secured pole position by a massive margin, and during the race, he led from start to finish. He experienced several worrying moments, including a brief over-revving incident and the loss of one exhaust megaphone, but nothing could prevent victory. He finished ahead of Graham Hill and secured his second Formula One World Championship. Lotus also won the Constructors' Championship. It was a moment of triumph for Chapman, Clark, and Team Lotus. The Lotus 33 proved capable of winning on fast circuits like Spa, as well as on technically punishing tracks like the Nürburgring. It was delicate enough to require careful management, yet effective enough to dominate the entire 1.5-liter era. After the triumph of 1965, the future of the Lotus 33 became complicated due to regulation changes. Beginning in 1966, Formula One adopted a new 3-liter engine formula. The previous 1.5-liter cars became obsolete almost overnight. Lotus intended to replace the 33 with the Lotus 43, powered by the BRM H16 engine. But that car proved heavy, complicated, and unreliable. As a result, the Lotus 33 remained in service longer than originally planned. Some chassis were fitted with enlarged 2-liter Climax V8 engines, or BRM V8 units. A car that had once been almost perfect under the previous regulations suddenly had to fight against more powerful machinery from Brabham, Ferrari, and Cooper. Even so, it remained competitive. Mike Spence won the non-championship South African race, and Clark still managed to extract performances that seemed impossible. By 1966, however, the Lotus 33 had become a transitional machine. It could not realistically compete long-term against new cars designed specifically for the 3-liter era. Its continued presence nevertheless demonstrated the strength of the original design. Even after a complete rule change, it could still score points and protect Lotus's reputation. In 1967, the Lotus 33 made one final important appearance before yielding completely to the revolutionary Lotus 49. At the Monaco Grand Prix team, Lotus believed the older, more compact, and better understood car would be better suited to the tight streets of Monte Carlo than the newer machinery. Jim Clark drove a Climax-powered Lotus 33 and set the fastest lap, though he eventually retired. Graham Hill, driving the BRM-powered version, finished second. It was one of the final great performances of the Lotus 33 in the World Championship. Symbolically, it was also the last time Jim Clark drove a Lotus 33 at Monaco. That same year, Clark also raced an evolved version of the car in the Tasman series and utterly dominated the championship, winning 5 of 8 races. It was a fitting conclusion to the career of the model. The Lotus 33 had been born as an evolution of the championship-winning Lotus 25, reached its peak in 1965, survived a major regulation change, and still managed to remain competitive in 1967. Very few racing cars enjoy such a long and significant competitive life in an era of such rapid technical development. One particular chassis occupies a special place in Lotus 33 history. R11, one of the most important surviving examples. It was the car in which Jim Clark won the Belgian, British, and German Grand Prix, as well as the non-championship Syracuse Grand Prix in 1965. It was this car that helped secure both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships. Chassis R11 debuted at Syracuse on April 4, 1965, and immediately won, although the circumstances were dramatic. Clark battled John Surtees and Joe Siffert, ultimately inheriting victory after his rivals encountered mechanical problems. Thereafter, R11 became one of Clark's primary weapons during the championship campaign. After the end of the 1.5-liter era, the car was modified for 2-liter engines, and in 1967 it was adapted for Graham Hill by raising the steering column to accommodate his taller frame. Later, the car was sold to Canadian privateer Mike Fisher, who entered it in the Canadian Grand Prix. Eventually, it was even converted to use an Oldsmobile V8 engine for Formula A racing. Decades later, the car resurfaced and entered a private collection. Today, R11 is considered one of the most valuable surviving Lotus Formula One cars because it combines originality, Jim Clark provenance, and direct links to the 1965 World Championship. The number of Lotus 33s built was extremely small. Most historians agree that only 6 genuine chassis were constructed, identified by numbers beginning with R8, although the histories of individual chassis became complicated due to rebuilds, repairs, and conversions between Lotus 25 and 33 specifications. R8 and R9 were the first cars built to Lotus 33 specification during 1964. R10 and R11 were more refined works cars created for the 1965 season. The number R12 was associated with the Lotus 39 Tasman car, while R13 later appeared in the hands of Reg Parnell Racing, although for years it was mistaken for a Lotus 25. The final chassis, R14, was built for a 2-liter BRM V8 engine during the 1966 season. The survival of these cars today is extremely important because most escaped heavy use in historic racing, allowing them to remain remarkably original. Some chassis entered museums, including the Schlumpf collection in France and the Caister Castle Museum in Britain, while others remain hidden in private collections. These are not cars that frequently appear in public. Every surviving Lotus 33 is essentially a relic from the age of Clark and Chapman. Determining the value of a Lotus 33 today is extremely difficult because cars of this significance rarely appear on the open market. This is not a typical collector car regularly sold at auction. We are discussing a factory Formula One machine from the mid-1960s, built in tiny numbers and directly associated with Jim Clark, Colin Chapman, and a World Championship campaign. Even an example without major race victories would likely be worth several million pounds. A car like R11, however, with direct links to Clark's championship-winning season, could command a far greater figure. Realistically, values could range from several million to well over 10 million pounds, depending on originality, documentation, race history, and market conditions. The most important Jim Clark cars approach almost mythical territory because owners rarely wish to part with them. For collectors, the appeal extends far beyond the fact that it is a Lotus Formula One car. It is a machine connected to one of the purest demonstrations of driving genius in motorsport history. That kind of significance cannot be measured in the same way as a classic road-going supercar. The Lotus 33 is also important because it demonstrates how a seemingly evolutionary design can become legendary. On paper, it was not radically new. It was essentially a refined Lotus 25, adapted for wider tires and more powerful engines. Yet that maturity became its greatest strength. In Formula One, the key is often not building the most complicated car, but refining every component until the entire package works harmoniously. The Lotus 33 had a brilliant monocoque, extremely low weight, effective suspension, and a sufficiently powerful engine. Most importantly, it was perfectly suited to Jim Clark. Clark did not need a brutal or aggressive machine. He needed a precise instrument that responded to the smallest inputs. The Lotus 33 became exactly that. In an era when drivers died regularly and mechanical failures were commonplace, the combination of Clark and the Lotus 33 seemed almost harmonious. It represented mechanical lightness combined with human perfection. For that reason, the model should never be viewed merely as a stepping stone between the Lotus 25 and Lotus 49. It was one of the most important cars in Team Lotus history. The technical specifications of the Lotus 33 perfectly reflected its philosophy. The car used an aluminum monocoque chassis and a mid-mounted naturally aspirated Coventry Climax FWMV V8 engine with a displacement of approximately 1.5 liters, later supplemented in certain versions by BRM, or enlarged 2-liter engines. Power output ranged from roughly 205 to around 220 horsepower, depending on specification. The transmission was a 5-speed ZF manual gearbox. Wheelbase measured approximately 2,335 millimeters, while track width measured approximately 1,396 millimeters at the front and 1,421 millimeters at the rear. Weight remained close to 451 kilograms. The front suspension used wishbones and inboard spring damper units, while the rear relied on a lightweight arrangement of links and radius rods. Dunlop supplied the tires, while disc brakes handled the demands of an extremely light but very fast machine. In World Championship competition, the Lotus 33 entered 27 Grand Prix, scored 5 victories, achieved 8 podium finishes, secured 10 pole positions, and set 8 fastest laps. In 1965, it delivered both the Constructors' Championship for Lotus and the Drivers' Championship for Jim Clark. Those statistics came from relatively few starts, but represented extraordinary effectiveness. The legacy of the Lotus 33 is quieter today than it deserves to be, because Formula One history more often focuses on the revolutionary Lotus 25 and the groundbreaking Lotus 49. Yet without the Lotus 33, the story of Clark and Chapman's dominance would remain incomplete. It was this car that closed the 1.5-liter Formula One era in magnificent fashion. It proved that the monocoque chassis was not a one-time experiment, but the future of Grand Prix racing. It demonstrated that lightness and rigidity could matter more than brute power. It also became one of the final Formula One cars in which pure mechanical simplicity combined with absolute driver mastery. The Lotus 33 was not easy, but it was honest. It gave the driver exactly what he was capable of extracting from it. Jim Clark extracted almost everything. That is why the Lotus 33 remains one of the most important Formula One cars of the 1960s. Not the most dramatic, not the most famous, but one of the most effective and beautifully refined. It was a machine that appeared modest, yet won a world championship, survived a regulation revolution, succeeded outside Europe, and remains a symbol of a time when engineering genius and driving talent could outweigh the budget of an entire factory team.